Good afternoon, everyone. So grateful to our panelists for being here. We are so grateful to you at home who are tuning in. We've been really looking forward to this event. I'm delighted to be hosting this critical discussion with Margaret Kimberly, Tamara Lorincz, Ludo de Brabander, and Paul Robinson. My name is Bianca Mugyenyi. I'm with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, who are the organizers of today's event. And we want to offer thanks as well to our co-sponsoring organization, World Beyond War. World Beyond War, a global nonviolent movement to end war and establish a just and sustainable peace. So please find out more about the terrific work that they do. And perhaps Rachel Small, who's helping with in the background, can put a link there for folks to find out more about World Beyond War. We're also very grateful to the support of the Regina Peace Council, as well as the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, VOW, who are sponsoring this event as well. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge that many of us are gathered here today on Indigenous land. I'm speaking to you all from Montreal, or Tiohtià:ke, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among First Nations. So it's amazing to see this turnout. There were nearly 500 registrants for the event, which is phenomenal. We're now live streaming to Facebook as well, as I said. So if you have any pals that want to join, you can let them know that they can watch at facebook.com/Canada Policy. And I'll put that link in the chat as well. So before we begin, a bit of housewarming for folks. We'd love to hear from you. I can see lots of people are posting in the chat, which is wonderful. Hi, Colin. So I just want you to, we'd love to hear from you, but as always, please keep your comments civil, cordial, and free from racist, sexist, or otherwise harmful commentary. But let us know where you're tuning in from. And after our speakers give their introductory remarks, we're going to be opening up to questions from the audience. So please post your questions in the Q&A box, and we're going to get to as many of them as we can, time permitting. So again, my name is Bianca Mugyenyi. I'm here representing the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, which is an organization that challenges unjust foreign policy measures and aims to bridge the gap between the perception and reality of Canada's role in the world. The CFPI also works to oppose the racism embedded in Canadian foreign policy. So you can find out more about the work that we do at foreignpolicy.ca. So our organization is funded entirely through donations. So please consider donating or becoming a sustainer member, which you can do at foreignpolicy.ca/donate. And so the reason why we're holding this event today is part of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute's call for a fundamental reassessment of Canadian foreign policy included a question that we posed, which was, should Canada continue to be a part of NATO or instead pursue non-military paths to power in the world? If we're serious about having a foreign policy that's based on peace, human rights, and overcoming global inequities, the answer is clear. According to military historian Jack Granatstein, NATO is the alliance to which Canada has devoted perhaps 90% of its military efforts since 1949. So before we begin, I just want to talk about some of NATO's intense and lesser known history. 72 years ago to tomorrow, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization officially came into existence. A year before its inception, the US, UK, and Canada held initial private meetings to found the alliance. And two of the main reasons for establishing NATO, in a nutshell, weakening left-wing forces in post-war Europe and strengthening the US empire. During World War II, the rich and the powerful, as well as the church who had supported the fascists, were now discredited. And the communist parties were becoming very popular in Greece and Italy and France in the late 40s. Tens of thousands of American troops were stationed in Western Europe as part of NATO to blunt the possible rise of domestic communist parties. In March 1949, our then Canadian External Minister, Lester Pearson, was very open about this element of NATO and said the following in the House of Commons. He said, "The power of the communists, wherever that power flourishes, depends upon their availability to suppress and destroy the free institutions that stand against them. They pick them off one by one, the political parties, the trade unions, the churches, the schools, the universities, the trade associations, even the sporting clubs and the kindergartens. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is meant to be a declaration to the world that this kind of conquest from within will not in the future take place amongst us." Close quote. The second main motivation for NATO was to reinforce the European colonial system and bring it under the US orbit. So to maintain their colonies, European powers increasingly depended upon the North American diplomatic and financial assistance. Between 1950 and 1958, Canada donated a whopping $1.5 billion, which in today's terms is $8 billion in ammunition, in fighter jets, in military training, and more to European countries through NATO's mutual aid program. So while European powers, and all this while European powers were suppressing independence movements in Algeria, in Kenya, in Vietnam, and in Congo, among other places. So this is a very, very important history to consider as we mark NATO's anniversary and Canada's involvement with the alliance. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our first guest, Margaret Kimberly. I'm so excited to have you here, Margaret. Margaret Kimberly is a co-founder and editor and senior columnist for the Black Agenda Report. She's the author of Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents, and a contributor to the anthologies Capitalism in a Ventilator, The Impact of COVID-19 on China and the US, In Defense of Julian Assange, and Killing Trayvons, an anthology of American violence. Her work as an activist includes leadership roles in the Black Alliance for Peace, the United National Anti-War Coalition, and the US Peace Memorial Foundation. Welcome, Margaret.
Let me unmute. Hello. Thanks, everybody. Greetings. I thank the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute for inviting me to participate, and I thank you for joining us for this important discussion. 2 years ago, on March 19th, 2011, member states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, began an aerial bombardment of the North African nation, Libya. The end result was a death toll of an estimated 50,000 people, the murder of that country's president, and a humanitarian crisis, which includes slavery and the deaths of migrants using Libya as an embarkation point for Europe. 10 years later, Libya is in the midst of a civil war and still has no functioning government. This is but one example of the dangers of NATO, which is little more than a cartel carrying out acts of aggression around the world. NATO is the primary tool of the Atlanticist hegemon and therefore poses a great danger. The title of the webinar, Why Canada Should Leave NATO, but I'm not Canadian, I'm a USian, if you will. I try not to say American because that encompasses the entire hemisphere. The US is the creator of NATO, the driving force behind its formation during the days of the Cold War. For the first half of my life, I was taught that NATO was a necessary counterweight to the Soviet bloc, Warsaw Pact, and I was told that this evil empire was devoted to destroying me and my way of life. Of course, the Soviet Union ceased to exist 30 years ago. The Russian Federation is no longer socialist, and the other members of the Warsaw Pact now belong to NATO. Those groundbreaking changes proved to me that I had been lied to about the threat of the Soviet Union, which collapsed relatively quickly and which lost its influence over Eastern Europe. NATO literally has no reason to exist. Or rather, I should say that its reason for existing is not what we have been told for the last 72 years. The idea that NATO is a benevolent entity and that any other alliance is therefore bad is a trope of propaganda, but unfortunately is accepted all too often. When Donald Trump questioned America's role in NATO, that is to say, the amount this country spends on defense as opposed to other countries, he was called a traitor and a Kremlin dupe, etc. But his goal was to make other nations spend more on defense, and being the good vassals that they are, they did as the president said they should. Of course, that means that they spend less money on the well-being of their citizens. Just one problem with this alliance that acts against the interests of millions of people. The United States is like every other empire in history and needs puppet governments and vassal states to help do its bidding. It was funny to watch leaders who allegedly didn't like Trump do exactly what he wanted, whether it was spending more on defense or proclaiming Juan Guaido interim president of Venezuela, or arresting a Huawei executive under dubious legal authority, or occupying Haiti. They work hand in hand, and the pretext of doing so for the good side is usually what is expressed. Yes, Canada should leave NATO. Everyone should leave NATO because the very structure is necessary only to accomplish evil ends. People in Canada, the US, and every other NATO member state should seek to dismantle the entire scheme because of the terrible suffering it has caused. Let's look at Syria, a country that has been devastated by 10 years of war. The same jihadist proxies used by NATO nations to conquer Libya went on to do more damage to Syria. Because of the nation that we're told is evil, Russia, the jihadists were defeated militarily, and Syria might have had a chance to rebuild. But the losing NATO nations were insistent on destroying the Syrian government. They've all bombed Syria at various times, and in 2018 under very suspicious circumstances, claiming that the government gassed its citizens. Thankfully, whistleblowers came forward and cast doubt on the plan and may have prevented a much wider war. Now Syrians are literally going hungry because with the US in the lead, NATO members have enacted terrible sanctions. US troops and allies occupy 1/3 of that country and steal its oil and wheat. One of the reasons that these interventions can be carried out so easily is that the US and its NATO allies have more than 800 bases and other facilities around the world. Closing them down is an essential part of ending NATO. I am a member of the United National Anti-War Coalition and the Black Alliance for Peace, and both groups are part of this closed foreign bases coalition. These facilities pollute local governments, local communities, deprive people all over the world of having the input they should have with their own governments, and make a mockery of claims of democracy. One such example is Ireland. Ireland is officially neutral and not a NATO member, but it supports NATO efforts through the Partnership for Peace program and the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, and allows the US to use its Shannon Airport as troops and materiel are transported to Middle Eastern nations. There are many activists in Ireland who are quite vocal in their opposition, but they are met with arrests and a determination by the state to silence them. Ireland is but one example of how NATO undoes the popular will in many countries. NATO is but one mechanism which ensnares people all over the world. Canada is a member of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. The UK and its settler colonial offshoots of Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand share intelligence information. And just a few days ago, a Canadian minister advocated that the group work more closely together in an anti-China effort. The Five Eyes work without oversight and none are transparent. No one knows who is under surveillance, why, and what information is shared internationally. And we see again how these alliances work against the public good. There's ominous news coming from Ukraine. NATO-led nations led by the US chose sides in Ukraine's internal dispute and ousted the elected president in 2014. Some of those who took power are in fact neo-Nazis. And thanks to this intervention, Ukraine is now the poorest country in Europe and in an ongoing civil war. Ukraine is not a NATO member, but acts in concert, and the troop buildup in the eastern part of that country is very troubling indeed. I will close with the story from my own country. The Trump administration signed an agreement to begin a drawdown of troops from Afghanistan, but was immediately stymied in the effort by the bipartisan War Party. Now there's an additional issue created by the paying of billions of dollars in private contracts as part of the occupation process. Despite the signing of the Doha Agreement last February that called for a drawdown of troops, the Defense Department issued nearly $1 billion in contracts to 17 different countries related to work in Afghanistan past the withdrawal date. With the deadline approaching and no formal decision from the Biden White House, the future of the contracts remain unclear, but the Pentagon could potentially have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements or face years of litigation if the US pulls out of the country. This is a quote from CNN. If they have $1 billion worth of contracts, they're going to have a barrel full of lawsuits on their hands unless they're willing to settle for whatever amount the contractors can ask for, said a Defense Department spokesman. Now, if I said that the military-industrial complex created and sustained wars and occupation, the charge would be denied, and I would be called a conspiracy theorist or some other name. But there you have it in black and white, straight from the horse's mouth. And that is the problem of NATO. It encourages war and occupations and does so on behalf of imperialist interests. Let us begin anew and end all of these alliances that kill, take public assets, and deprive millions of people of their democratic rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Margaret for just detailing that big picture role of NATO as a tool of US empire, war, and occupation. I can't wait to hear more from you in the Q&A portion. If people have questions for Margaret, please put them in the chat. So our next speaker is Ludo de Brabander. Ludo de Brabander is a Belgian activist and spokesperson for the organization Vrede, VZW. He's a member of the International Coordination Committee of No to War, No to NATO. He was one of the organizers of the last two NATO counter summits in Brussels in May 2017 and July 2018. He's the author of several books on NATO, militarization, the Middle East, and the Kurdish issue, and travels regularly through the Middle East and writes in various printed and electronic publications. Welcome, Ludo.
Welcome. Thank you, Bianca. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my views on NATO and the implications of its policies for member states. So in my contribution, I would like to focus on a very important report that is recently published under the title NATO 2030 United for a New Era. It has been published last December by a 10-member group of so-called experts and at the request of NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg. And these experts put forward 138 recommendations on how NATO should adapt for the next decade. This report has to be discussed at the next NATO summit later this year, probably in June. I received the date 14th of June in Brussels, in my country, to develop the new NATO strategy for the coming years. As usually, NATO claims to act as a security organization, but in reality, it seeks to perpetuate and strengthen the hegemonic role of the alliance. An important part of the report is dedicated to the supposed threat by Russia and China as systemic rivals. And it's written in a language very reminiscent of the Cold War. Calling Russia and China a systemic rival reminds us to the national defense security that has been published by Jim Mattis in 2018, where China and Russia were called systemic rivals. Since 2014, NATO summit declarations have devoted entire pages to the Russian danger. Although Russia is a nuclear armed state, that's true, it has a defense budget that is barely 7% of that of the NATO member states. Nevertheless, NATO cultivates exaggerated perceptions of Russian military threats. In NATO's ideological framework, there is little room for criticism on its own behavior, nor for insights that try to understand why a stated opponent reacts in a specific way. And this applies, for example, to the territorial expansion of NATO towards Russian borders. Declarations that Ukraine and Georgia, two former Soviet states, could eventually become NATO member states, as it has been discussed at the Bucharest summit in 2008. Or the development of a missile shield, the deployment of NATO troops in Poland and the Baltic states on a rotational, so-called rotational basis, just to name a few. So in other words, while the report regularly warns explicitly against disinformation campaigns by Russia and China, it unsurprisingly doesn't provide any interpretation, nor does it understand the Russian perspective on the security context in Europe. The NATO report is therefore primarily an exercise in formulating its reasons for existence, essentially based on a whipped up, oversimplified enemy image. Rather new is the prominent place given to China in NATO's security doctrine, called a full spectrum systemic rival. China is a rising power, but you can read the reality and the nature of Chinese foreign and military policy in a more nuanced way. Unlike the US, China is not at all, militarily spoken, a global player. The country has only one overseas military base. The US, as Margaret has mentioned, has hundreds of them, 800 or more. The US has, for example, also 21 aircraft carriers patrolling around the world, including South China Sea, and China has 2 of them. NATO blames China for renewing its nuclear arsenal, but the US has by far the largest nuclear modernization program underway, worth $1,700 billion after inflation, $1,700 billion. One part of this program, for example, is the replacement of the Minya 3 ballistic missiles. This program only would cost $100 billion for the taxpayers in US. China's nuclear arsenal is 20 times smaller than that of the US. And it's true, Beijing has invested heavily in recent years to modernize its military apparatus, but so have most NATO member states. China's military budget is 1/3 of the US and less than 1/4 of that of NATO. And China has experienced a number of border conflicts in recent decades, some of which have even a military dimension, but it's far from the scale, the geographic and intensity scale, like the violent conflicts involving US and other NATO member states and NATO itself. The report, NATO 2030 report, portrays China in terms of aggression, but it's primarily about expanding economic and trade activities. What is China doing? NATO appears to want to prevent China from claiming the dominant position of the US and Europe in the world. And in other words, China is not allowed to do what NATO member states have been doing for decades. The report also shatters the illusion that NATO is serious about nuclear disarmament. And I quote from the report, "We also underline that NATO continues to have a critical role to play in maintaining both conventional and nuclear deterrence and defense through allied nuclear arsenals and via US forward deployments of nuclear weapons in Europe." End of quote. The experts are undoubtedly concerned about the impact of the Ban Treaty, the TPNW, on NATO's nuclear posture. And that's with reason, of course. If only one member state would exceed the treaty, this could end the self-proclaimed nuclear solidarity of the alliance and erode the legitimacy of nuclear weapons possession by the alliance nuclear weapon states. In the report, the experts argue that all members should, and I quote, should recall their position on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, namely that it will never contribute to practical disarmament, nor will it affect international law. And last year in December, NATO made it clear again with a special briefing stating that the Ban Treaty will never become international law. To conclude, there are many issues in the report that NATO addresses with one-sided militaristic approaches or as a way to expand its influence. Since 2014, NATO obliges member states to further increase military budgets and investments. So everybody knows probably that all countries should spend, according to NATO, 2% of their BBP on defense, and 20% of their military budgets should be used for military investments. It continues to do so despite COVID-19 pandemic. The military budget of all NATO states increased from $896 billion to $1,028 billion between 2014 and 2020. And according to the latest NATO figures last month, for example, Canada saw a real increase of military expenditure of almost 45% since 2014. There are countries that more than doubled their military budgets in only 6 years. To give a few: Hungary, 147%, Lithuania, 180%, Latvia 171%, Slovakia 122%. So in other words, NATO prevents individual member states from choosing disarmament, denuclearization, political dialogue, and common and cooperative security. It ignores the root causes of conflict and chooses militaristic approaches without even considering its own role in creating insecurity. In fact, it's the most important insecurity organization in the world. Just an example, NATO member states are responsible for 2/3 of the global arms trade, with warring countries such as Saudi Arabia as top destinations. Or the war in Iraq 2003 and Libya 2011 caused regional instability in the Middle East and the Sahel and created the breeding ground for extremist armed groups. NATO 2030 will be translated, as I said, in a new security doctrine to be endorsed in the next NATO summit in Brussels later this year. It's a recipe for encouraging a new Cold War 2.0. Arms race and more wars. In short, the report proves again that NATO is an instrument of the military-industrial complex endangering human security and a just and peaceful world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ludo. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for helping us to understand how this is not a defensive alliance, as well as the implications for disarmament, nuclear and otherwise. And I would like to encourage folks at home to take a look at the report that Ludo referenced. It's called NATO 2030, United for a New Era. So I'm looking very forward to hearing more from you during the Q&A period. Our next speaker is Tamara Lorincz. Tamara Lorincz is a PhD candidate at the Balsillie School for International Affairs. She's a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Canadian Pugwash Group, and the No to NATO Network. Tamara is also on the International Advisory Council of World Beyond War and the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. She's also a fellow of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. Welcome, Tamara.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to pick up on something that Margaret said. The United States has always dominated and dictated NATO. The supreme allied commander of the NATO armed forces has always been an American general. The first supreme allied commander of NATO was General Dwight Eisenhower, who of course later became president and warned in his farewell address against the military-industrial complex. On Ludo's discussion about NATO 2030, I want to add that if NATO 2030 comes to pass, if we don't stop it, the international community cannot prevent catastrophic climate change, and the international community cannot achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We simply cannot sustain NATO's costly and carbon-intensive militarism over the next decade and achieve these goals. NATO is militarizing Canadian foreign policy, and it is weaponizing the women, peace, and security agenda. Right now, Canada is training Iraqi police as part of a NATO operation, which is helping the United States occupy Iraq. Canada has 540 soldiers in Latvia leading a NATO battle group. Canada has fighter jets in Romania and warships in the Mediterranean and Black Sea on NATO operations. Right now, Canada is leading a NATO maritime group. But by contrast, Canada only has 42 soldiers on UN peacekeeping missions. Canada is not a peacekeeping country. Because of NATO, we are a war-making country. But I want to go back and quickly talk about why NATO has expanded since the end of the Cold War. In 1992, when the Warsaw Pact ended, there was no longer a justification for the alliance and for high military spending. Yet NATO expanded. Since 1992, membership has doubled. 14 new countries have joined the alliance. Why did NATO expand? Why did it not disband? The key architect of NATO expansion in the mid-1990s was an American, Bruce Jackson, who was the vice president of strategic planning for Lockheed Martin. the largest weapons manufacturer in the United States. He formed and led the US Committee to Expand NATO. Jackson traveled with the CEO of Lockheed Martin, Norm Augustine, to Eastern European countries to convince them to join the Transatlantic Alliance. Then back in the United States, Jackson and Augustine wined and dined senators and pushed them to support NATO expansion. One of the staunchest supporters of the alliance in the Senate during this period was Senator Joe Biden. In 1998, the Senate voted overwhelmingly to approve Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic as new members of the alliance. But ironically, that same year, the Senate voted to reject the United States from joining the Kyoto Protocol. Then Jackson and Augustine pressured the US government to give loan guarantees to these Eastern European countries to buy US weapons. The Committee to Expand NATO then evolved into the Project on Transitional Democracies, still headed by Bruce Jackson. In the early 2000s, the Project on Transitional Democracies lobbied the US government to admit more members into NATO: Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Now, to become a member of the alliance, countries have to meet certain political, economic, and military conditions. They have to move towards a free market economy, and they have to modernize their militaries to be interoperable with NATO allies. This is why US weapons manufacturers love NATO. It's a guaranteed market for their weapons. This is why Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics are big funders of the NATO Association of Canada, which has its office in Toronto. The NATO Association of Canada is the propaganda arm of the alliance in this country. Now think about this. In 2011, it was a Canadian Lieutenant General, Charles Bouchard, who led the NATO bombing of Libya. 2 years after he retired, Bouchard became head of Lockheed Martin Canada. Lockheed and other US weapons manufacturers spend a lot of money to hire lobbyists and consultants in this country to secure lucrative defense contracts and keep military spending high. So no wonder now Canada has a competition to buy 88 new fighter jets for a life cycle cost of $77 billion. And Canada is in the process of building 15 warships for a life cycle cost of $268 billion. And 2 years ago, the Liberal government gave a sole source contract to General Dynamics to build new tanks for $3 billion. These are things we don't need. They're totally unproductive, but the federal government says we need them to meet our NATO commitments. These weapon systems, though, are extremely carbon intensive. This is why I have argued that NATO is one of the greatest threats and to the climate, and one of the biggest obstacles to the Paris Agreement. And it's going to get worse. In 2014, at the Wales Summit, NATO members made a commitment to spend 2% of GDP for defense, and of that amount, 20% for weapons systems. Last month, NATO released its defense expenditures report, which showed that Canada's military spending in 2020 was $30.8 billion, but that's only 1.4% of GDP. By contrast, last year, the Canadian government spent only $2 billion on global affairs, $1.9 billion on the Department of Environment and Climate Change, $2 billion on Indigenous services. So we are spending 15 times more on the military than we do on than we do on diplomacy, environment, or Indigenous communities. 3 years ago, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Defense released a report entitled Canada and NATO, an alliance forged in strength and reliability. The 2018 report recommended that Canada increase military spending to meet our NATO 2% target and to increase public education so that Canadians support the alliance. The committee chair was Liberal MP, Liberal Member of Parliament, Stephen Fuhr, a former NATO qualified fighter pilot for the Canadian Armed Forces. And the vice chair of the committee was NDP MP Randall Garrison, For the past 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, the NDP has sided with NATO. The NDP supported the NATO bombing of Serbia in 1999, and the NDP unanimously supported the extension of Canada's bombing of Libya in 2011. The NDP was the official opposition at the time. The NDP MPs who voted for this motion included Peter Julian, Libby Davies, Megan Leslie, Charlie Angus, Jean Crowder, and Nikki Ashton. After the vote, Prime Minister Stephen Harper crossed the floor and he shook hands with the NDP leader, Thomas Mulcair. The only MP who voted against the motion was Elizabeth May of the Green Party. However, the Green Party does not oppose NATO, which means it supports it. The NDP definitely supports NATO. That's very clear from its voting record and from the statements of its defense critic, Randall Garrison. And right now, there are at least 3 NDP MPs on the Canada-NATO Parliamentary Association, including Garrison, Jack Harris, and Daniel Blakey. But the NDP and the Green Party, they can't be serious about tackling the climate crisis or tackling the poverty crisis if they continue to support NATO and its demands for increased military spending and new fossil fuel-powered weapon systems. The NDP and the Green Party also can't be serious about their support for nuclear disarmament if they do not call for Canada to get out of a nuclear-armed alliance. Canada is shamefully not joining the new landmark treaty to abolish nuclear weapons. These are the worst weapons of mass destruction for which there is no humanitarian response because of our membership in NATO. Finally, I want to stress that most of the world is not in NATO. Of the 193 countries that are part of the United Nations, only 30 in NATO. There are countries like Austria and Mexico that are not members of NATO because of their commitments to neutrality. And these 2 countries, led the negotiations on the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So in conclusion, I would like to say that NATO circumvents the United Nations Security Council. NATO undermines the United Nations. NATO's so-called rules-based order undermines international law. So it is an imperative for us to build a national resistance to NATO. We need to delegitimize the alliance. We need to change the political and public discourse in this country that says that NATO provides security. NATO has proven in this pandemic that it is totally useless to meet the real human security challenges that we're facing, and it is exacerbating the climate crisis. So I say Canada should get out of NATO. No to NATO. Thanks.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you so much for that passionate and comprehensive description of NATO's impact on promoting militarism in Canada, as well as impacts on the SDGs, climate targets, nuclear disarmament, and more. Can't wait to hear more from you during the Q&A. Our next speaker of the afternoon is Paul Robinson. Paul Robinson holds an MA in Russian and Eastern European Studies from the University of Toronto and a Doctor of Philosophy in Modern History from the University of Oxford. Prior to his graduate studies, he served as a regular officer in the British Army Intelligence Corps from 1989 to 1994, and as a reserve officer in the Canadian Forces from 94 to 96. Having published 6 books, he's also written widely for the international press on political issues. His research focuses generally on military affairs. In recent years, he has worked on Russian history, military history, defense policy, and military ethics. Welcome, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Bianca, for having me. I think it's quite natural for states and for peoples to want to play some sort of role in the world beyond their own borders and to do something which is more than just a sort of naked pursuit of national interest, and also to feel that they matter in some way. And if you're United States or perhaps China or Russia, this is something you could perhaps do on your own, but most states aren't capable of doing this, and therefore, in order to get this feeling of mattering and to have a sense of having status and influence, you need to be part of some larger whole. And it's natural as well then to seek to do this within some sort of community of states with which you feel you have something in common. And for this sense, I mean, Canada's membership of NATO has been in a way quite logical, because it's a way that Canadians have felt that they can enhance their country's reputation among the states which matter to them, that's to say other liberal democracies. However, while this is quite understandable, I think one needs to balance this desire for sort of influence and status with some sort of more utilitarian understanding of whether what you're doing is actually doing any good, either to yourself or to the broader community. One could take an example, for instance, of Canada's military campaign in Afghanistan. Clearly, many Canadians supported this because we felt that this was in some way supposedly doing some good, but also it was a way of winning influence and status within the NATO alliance, and supposedly that was of some sort of benefit to us as a nation. But then if you ask, well, what did we actually achieve? You have to answer, well, absolutely nothing. And 150 Canadians lost their lives essentially for no benefit, whereas these sort of sense of belonging or whatever we get from it is very intangible. And I think that's really the sort of way, if we're discussing NATO, we need to look into this. Is NATO actually the best way for a state such as Canada to achieve this sort of sense of identity and belonging in the world that we are after? And increasingly, I mean, in my younger days, I was an army officer in NATO forces in what was then West Germany, and it seemed very logical to me to do this. But as time has gone on, I've become increasingly skeptical of this, and particularly because I'm a student of Russia, and therefore I think it's worth spending some time looking at what effect NATO has had on Russia and Russia's role in the world and conflict between East and West. Now, back in the Cold War, NATO made some sort of sense in terms of deterring any Soviet attack. Whether the Soviets actually ever intended to attack is in a sense neither here nor there. We could never be entirely sure. And there was a certain logic in a sort of better safe than sorry strategy. But of course, the Soviet threat is long gone, and modern day Russia, for all its many deficiencies, is not remotely like the Soviet Union. And people who attempt to tell you that it's some sort of modern totalitarian state simply don't know what they're talking about. And Russia's military capabilities, despite recent headlines saying that they could smash the British army and so on, are not what they're made out to be either, and certainly nothing compared with the Soviet capabilities. But there's something more, I think, important which has happened than just sort of the military dimension here. There's a sort of certain psychological dimension which results from NATO's existence. And I was reading last week a book about Soviet reformers. These were members of the Communist Party in the late Soviet era, who then became sort of part of Gorbachev's inner circle and were the people who led to the reforms of perestroika and glasnost and ultimately the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what drove these people was very much a sense of a European identity and a desire to be reintegrated into the European family and construct what Gorbachev himself called a common European home. And it was this desire essentially to be at one with the West and to fulfill this Western identity or European identity more narrowly that drove them. But it didn't work out for them. Because Russia has not become part of the West. And why is this? Well, the reason is essentially because once the West was a sort of idea, it wasn't, there was no thing called the West. In fact, it was a sort of concept, right? And you could believe in this concept and be part of it. But what has happened since the collapse of the Soviet Union is that the West has become institutionalized. Really through the European Union and through NATO. And it's been institutionalized in such a way that Russia cannot be part of it. Which means that however much you may have an aspiration to be European, if you are Russian, you never can be, because institutional barriers have been created, which means it is by necessity impossible. So, for instance, if you look back to, say, the 18th and 19th century, at that point, Europe was, it was not one thing, right? So Russia was part of Europe because it was always part of some alliance, one time with the French, another time with the English, another time with the Germans. The alliances sort of came and went, right? But there was never a sort of thing of all of Europe against Russia. Russia was part of a European system of alliances. Now this broke down really at the end of the Second World War, when the Cold War put Western Europe against Eastern Europe. But there was hope that when the war came down in 1989, Russia could then be reintegrated within this common European home. But that's not actually what happened, because the expansion of the European Union and NATO has created a situation in which essentially this institutionalized West has moved eastwards up until Russia's borders and then drawn a line and divided the European continent into two, Europe and Russia, and created a situation in which Russia cannot be part of Europe. This therefore removes any of those incentives which previously existed for people within Russia to be part of the West. There's no reason for them to reform themselves to abide by what we would call Western norms, because they're not going to be accepted into the club regardless. And there's no particular reason for them to modify their conception of their national interests to satisfy NATO or the EU, because they're not going to be part of Europe, whatever come what may. They've been institutionally, cut off from the rest of the European continent. And this, I think, is basically, therefore, institutionalizing conflict. And this is what the effect of the expansion of not just NATO, but also the European Union has had. It is essentially institutionalized conflict between Russia and the rest of Europe. Now, NATO says that Russians shouldn't be worried by expansion because NATO is a defensive alliance. Now, this is true to the extent that I think NATO has no intentions of militarily attacking Russia. It would be suicidal to do so. However, the idea that NATO is a defensive alliance is not one that anyone but a handful of Russians would take seriously. Following the war on Kosovo, the invasion of Iraq, in which many NATO countries took part, the bombing of Libya, and so on, Russians do not regard NATO as a defensive alliance in any way, shape, or form. And it doesn't really matter whether they're right or wrong so to think. NATO says, well, they're wrong to think that, so why should we pay any attention to it? Well, it doesn't really matter if they're right or wrong to think about it. They do think that. They regard NATO as an expansionist and aggressive institution, and as one which they need to take measures against, essentially, well, just in case. Just as NATO sort of needed to exist just in case the Soviets attacked back in the Cold War, the Russians similarly feel that they need to do things just in case themselves. So Latvia, for instance, is 6,500 miles away from Ottawa, where I am right now. It's 0 miles from the Russian Federation because it's right next door. Okay, Canada has sent troops 6,500 miles to Russia's border. Russia has not sent any troops 6,500 kilometers to our border. So from a Russian perspective, who is threatening who? And when NATO says, Russia is a threat, but it's us who sent troops 6,000 kilometers to their border, it's unrealistic essentially to think that they will take it seriously, that, we are not threatening them in any way, shape or form. And of course, similarly, the support Canada and other NATO states have given for the post-Maidan revolution government in Ukraine, and for the actions taken by the Ukrainian army in Donbass, which has resulted in the deaths of many thousands of people, similarly are seen by Russians as signs of essentially ill intent. Now, what can one conclude from this? Well, I think one can conclude from this that NATO is not actually helping provide security in Europe, because it is institutionalizing conflict between Europe and Russia. and it is creating a sense of insecurity. That may not be intentional, but that is the ultimate effect. Does that mean then that Canada should leave NATO? Well, of course, if Canada alone was to leave NATO, nothing would change, because this institutional division of Europe I've spoken about would still exist. So essentially, Canada leaving NATO would perhaps have some benefits for Canada in terms of enabling us to cut our defense expenditure. But it wouldn't resolve the more fundamental problems which come about as a result of NATO's continued existence. I think what we need to be thinking of is more about what new forms of security architecture can be created for the North Atlantic and European region. Okay, and that requires some degree of new thinking, as Gorbachev called it back then. Except, of course, now it requires new thinking from us, really, rather than from them. What that would be, of course, is something for a future discussion. But for now, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you for sharing this critical information about the impact of NATO on Russia, the false geographic divide, and the institutionalization of the West, and the institutionalization of conflict. So that concludes our presentations for today, and we're now going to be moving into the Q&A portion of our evening. Thank you to the many, many of you that have shared questions with us in the Q&A box. So the first two questions I'm going to ask together, as they're similar, and these are for all panelists. Please feel free to jump in. Garth asks, can Canada sign the nuclear non-proliferation ban while still in NATO? And Richard Denton asks, should Canada work within NATO to get rid of its nuclear doctrine, or leave NATO and then not have any influence? Over to you, panelists.
Well, I'll start and just say that for at least 40 years, the argument has been made that Canada should work within NATO to reduce its reliance on nuclear weapons or to get rid of its nuclear deterrence. And Canada has never been able to do that. And Canada really isn't interested in doing that. It is unrealistic to think that Canada, with a defense budget of $30 billion, taking on the nuclear armed NATO allies, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, to give up their nuclear weapons. It's just not going to happen. And the other thing is, it's unrealistic to think that NATO is ever going to get rid of its nuclear weapons. NATO nuclear weapons have been part of NATO's weapon systems, its fundamental capability since its inception in 1949. And as you heard from Ludo, all of the nuclear armed NATO allies are modernizing their arsenals, and so Canada just is not going to be able to change NATO's reliance on its nuclear deterrence. So I think really the only genuine option is for Canada to get out of NATO, because we should be so outraged and so opposed to nuclear weapons. I mean, these are the worst weapons of mass destruction. So as I said, Canada should get out of NATO if we're serious about nuclear disarmament.
Ludo.
Yeah. About Canada and TPNW, if it could sign it while being in NATO, well, there is a tremendous pressure on member states by the inner circle, I don't know who, the US, of course, and maybe other military industrial complex in general, not to sign, and even in a threatening way. But it's not a treaty obligation. Nuclear arms are not part of the establishing treaty of NATO. So it can, legally it can. So it's not an obligation. NATO only defined itself a nuclear alliance in 2010 at the summit in Lisbon. Before, it was not defined as a nuclear alliance. And but if Canada or another country would sign, a NATO country would sign the PEN treaty, this could have a domino effect and probably give other countries also the opportunity or the courage to sign it. I think, and it would, let's say, make an end of put an end to the so-called nuclear alliance as NATO defines itself. Leaving NATO and then having no influence in NATO, well, leaving it is an influence. I mean, if you would leave NATO as a country, that would be the first time that that this would happen, and this could make enormous discussions in other NATO countries, because in every country, also in my country, in Belgium, we try to put it on the agenda. But of course, there is this pressure from the US and other countries. But I think if one country would leave NATO, this would open lots of opportunities to other countries to discuss this subject and eventually leaving NATO as well. So this is the influence you can have when you're leaving, when Canada would leave NATO.
Thank you, Ludo. Anyone else like to chime in? All right, so I'll move on to the next question, which is from Scott Costin. If we left NATO, there would be tremendous pressure on the federal government to strengthen military ties with the United States in order to ensure Canada's security. Is it possible we'd be trading the quote unquote devil we know for something potentially worse?
Yeah, and I can say something a little bit on this. I mean, one of the arguments for memberships of sort of multilateral organizations, from Canadian membership in multilateral organizations, it's better to be in a large organization with multiple members than to be a purely one-on-one relationship with the United States, because it allows us to some degree, allows us a little bit more independence and a little less pressure than we would get if we were sort of in a more dependent, possibly, relationship with our neighbors to the south, and that essentially what Canada needs to do is just to get a place at the table, and that the sort of ideal Canadian strategy is to spend the minimum amount required to get a seat at the table and do nothing more, essentially, right? So just sort of get your foot in the door and leave it at that. The problem with that, of course, is it's very difficult once you're in there to follow that strategy of just sort of doing the minimum to get your seat at the table, because then no one takes you very seriously at the table, and also you get very institutionalized, and there is, you know, the generals, they like to be able to turn up at a NATO meeting and have people take them seriously, which they're not going to do if they're not sort of contributing anything, right? So you get subjected to all sorts of peer pressures. There's a degree of culturalization within this community, which then sort of sucks you in rather further than you would like to be. But overall, I think it's a very good question, and I don't have a very, you know, good answer to it. Certainly, if we were outside of NATO, we would still need to have some military relationship with the United States for things such as air defense of the North American continent. Okay, so you know, what would be the future status of NORAD post NATO? So difficult questions like that would have to be resolved, and I think it'd be somewhat unrealistic to imagine that outside of NATO, Canada could sever all military relationships with the United States, and particularly in terms of procurement as well, because our ability to provide for ourselves for even a much smaller military would be very difficult, because we don't have the armaments industry to provide even for a much smaller military. So there's going to be a military relationship with the United States, come what may.
I would like to argue that it's vital that Canada sever its military relationship with the United States. The United States is the, as Dr. King said, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. The United States is leading illegal wars and coups all over the world. It is high time that Canada get out of its defense relationship with the United States in NATO and in NORAD. One of the justifications that the federal government is using right now for Canada to get new fighter jets is because not only of our membership in NATO, but because of NORAD as well. But we know that fighter jets are not necessary for the real human security challenges that we're facing. So this question also must cause us to reflect on what security really means. And we need to demilitarize our understanding of security. Security means affordable housing, safe drinking water in this country, free education, free healthcare, vaccines to everyone, public transit, action on climate change. And those human security challenges require global cooperation, and Canada is already at the seat, already has a seat at the table in the United Nations, where we work with all other countries in the world on these challenges. Canada also has a seat on the European institution called the Organization for Security and Cooperation Europe, and Russia is also a part of that security organization, and it's a non-military security organization. We need to actually be honest about and have courage about calling for the demilitarization of our security policy.
I wanted to add one thing quickly. April 4th is also, ironically, the anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination. A year to the day before he was killed, April 4th, 1967, he publicly broke with the Johnson administration over the Vietnam War. And he was assassinated a year to the day later, and the two events are connected, and others are convinced. But I also want to say this, it's very clear to me that what we're talking about is really changing our societies, changing Canadian society, changing US society. So we no longer accept these lies that we're taught about security, and someone's going to attack Canada and someone's going to attack the US. Who's going to do that? They whip up fear and make us believe that we have to steal money from ourselves and give it to defense contractors to protect us from non-existent threats. And I believe they are non-existent threats. It is NATO that has been the aggressor. It's NATO that creates these threats. So I think when we hear that sort of talk, whichever country we're in, we have to reject it out of hand. And we have to work towards new societies where our money doesn't go for weapons of war, where our governments aren't coming up with rationales to destroy other nations. Anything less than that is going to just bring us back to where we are now.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add to that question? All right, so moving on to the next, Jennifer Talentier asks, is the UN doing anything to discourage and or help disband NATO?
In a word, no. UN is headquartered in the United States, lest we forget. The United Nations has a lot of authority, moral authority, I think, with people in most of the world. It is the instrument of carrying out international law, but at the end of the day, it's pretty toothless. And even though, as someone else pointed out, it's only a tiny number of nations in the world that belong to NATO. They are countries that support the UN financially. They're the wealthiest capitalist countries. They're very powerful, in short. And it would be very difficult for the United Nations as a body to discuss banning NATO. 3 of the 5 Security Council member states are NATO members. So in a word, no.
Yeah, well, maybe briefly to add, yeah, sorry, Tamara.
No, Please go ahead, Ludo.
No, just briefly, I agree with what Margaret said. And of course, NATO, it's even more, NATO is using UN for conducting military interventions, as you know. I mean, and as Margaret says, if you have several members of NATO into the Security Council as permanent members with veto right, this is, this is a question that is quickly answered. No, in UN, there's no possibility for the moment to discuss NATO or to disband it. But it's used by NATO. I mean, several security resolutions are like Libya. The war in Libya was under the pretext that it was under a resolution of United Nations, even if the interpretation was very large of it. It was protecting people, about protecting civilians, this resolution, but it became kind of giving air support to the armed opposition, whatever. Yeah, but it's no.
And if I could just add that, if I can recall correctly, the UN budget for the UN General Assembly and the UN agencies is a combined about $30 billion annually. And the United States contributes about 1/3 to that budget, about $10 billion. So the UN budget is about $30 billion. Compare that to combined NATO military spending of its 30 members at 1.7 trillion $1 trillion. The other thing is that this new report and agenda by NATO called NATO 2030, if you read it, it's very clear that it's also an agenda to expand NATO politically and if you read between the lines, I think it's also really challenging the United Nations. So it is very hard for the UN Secretary General, for instance, to speak out against NATO and other UN high representatives to speak out on NATO. But I have been on a call where some of them have been shaking their head when it's come up that NATO is undermining the United Nations.
Thank you. Our next question is from Peter Jones. To what extent is NATO primarily the implementation of US foreign policy? Why should Canada support a neoconservative and ethnophobic foreign policy? Is Canada immorally just doing the US's dirty work by supporting NATO?
Well, yes, it's. I referred to Canada and other NATO nations as U.S. puppet states, but I don't want to let them off the hook either. They also have interests, corporate interests around the world in various countries. So they do help the U.S. to destabilize Haiti and to intervene in Venezuela. So Canada's not just an innocent bystander victim. It has many of the same interests that control what happens in our government in the United States.
I could add another little thing in here. I think the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe and of course the European Union into Eastern Europe has somewhat changed the political dynamic by bringing into these organizations nations who have a very specific historical relationship with the Russian Federation, or Russia more generally, and who, to a large degree, see themselves as past victims of Russian imperialism and as potential future victims of Russian imperialism, and who therefore have brought into both the EU and NATO a very strongly anti-Russian line. So this would be the three Baltic states and Poland in particular. This has had, I think, quite a strong influence in pushing these organizations into a more hostile line against Russia. One could see this in the EU, for instance, with the EU Eastern Partnership project, which was pushed very strongly by the then Polish Foreign Minister, Radek Sikorski, along actually with the Swedish Foreign Minister, Carl Bildt, and was very much reflective of a sort of Eastern European anti-Russian perspective. And of course, it's the pushing of its Eastern Action Plan, which then provoked revolution in Ukraine and ultimately civil war in Ukraine and the driving of conflict with Russia. So there's much more going on within NATO and EU than just sort of American influence. Yes, I mean, America obviously is the biggest player, but there are other interests pushing it as well. And I think the NATO expansion has brought in groups who have interests, which I personally don't think are really Canadian interests, to be honest, and have pushed the alliance in a certain direction it would otherwise not have gone.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, well, as maybe you know, there is a famous quote of the first NATO Secretary General, Lord Ismay, telling that NATO, the reason why NATO is needed is to keep Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And I think, I mean, it's very clear that the US is the leading nation of NATO and is pushing its agenda to collectivize its agenda towards the other countries. There are many examples. I already talked about the nuclear alliance. For example, my country hosts 20, nobody knows really because it's a kind of secret, but open secret, but it's hosts 20 US nuclear bombs, as Italy does, the Netherlands, Germany, and Italy, and Turkey. So these are US nuclear bombs, but hosted in European countries. It's one of the examples how NATO is a kind of instrument of the United States. Remember that also the target of in Wales, the summit in Wales 2014, to have 2% of the military budget on 2% of the BBP that has to go to the military budget, that it's clearly put forward by the United States. And we have seen the behavior of Trump even to increase above 2%. So as I said, also according to the nuclear arms, the whole definition of calling China a systemic rival is coming directly from the US, and especially when Trump was in power and with all the tensions that came. And so it became, in the new NATO 2030 report, systemic rival also for NATO. So it's very clear that the NATO is conducting for a large part, even if there are other things in play, the US agenda on foreign policy and military policy, not to mention even the importance of NATO and NATO member states with standards of weapons and so to serve the military industry in the United States, of course, to become rich because of NATO.
And I want to add that Canada has independent corporate interests that push us to align with NATO. So, for instance, Canada, is a major oil and gas country with many oil and gas companies that are, are vying for control of pipelines, and Canada also hosts most of the mining companies on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Headquarters here. Canada has mining interests around the world that align with what we're doing in NATO. And I also want to add that Canada has never been held accountable for participating in illegal NATO wars and our operations. So we've never been held accountable for our illegal bombing of Serbia that included the use of depleted uranium that has harmed the Serbian people. Canada has never been held responsible for our bombing of Libya that's totally destroyed the country. Canada's never been held responsible for our NATO combat mission in Afghanistan. And in fact, the Canadian government is refusing to turn over documents to the International Criminal Court so they can investigate Canada's involvement in war crimes in Afghanistan. So, we really have to question what Canada is doing with NATO, the corporate interests, and also the military operations.
Thank you. The next question is from Henry Evans Tabrinka, and he asks, many Canadians confuse NATO with UN peacekeeping forces. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. What is being done to correct this misconception?
Well, I think we have to demystify peacekeeping. UN peacekeeping forces have been very problematic. They come in after the crime has been committed, and then the criminals hide behind the UN, who in effect give cover for the invasion or the occupation, and then they send in these peacekeepers. Someone said in the chat, peacekeepers brought cholera to Haiti. That is absolutely true. Among other things, UN peacekeepers have been accused themselves of human rights abuses, of sexual assaults, all kinds of things. So I think not only is it important to make the distinction, but also to be truthful about UN peacekeeping and stop acting as though it is some kind of benevolence in the world.
And also to build on what Margaret said, Canada is known for creating UN peacekeeping. Our Prime Minister, Lester Pearson, won the Nobel Peace Prize, for this initiative. So Canadians have believed for the past, 60 years that Canada is a peacekeeping country. What we're doing in the world is our Canadian soldiers are wearing blue helmets and, helping other countries stop armed conflict. Well, as I said in my remarks, and I need to repeat this again, is that Canada is at its lowest ever for contributing to UN peacekeeping. Right now, according to the latest statistics, Canada has only 42 peacekeepers on UN peace missions across around the world. By contrast, Canada has just on one NATO operation in Latvia, Canada has 540 soldiers leading a NATO battle group right on Russia's borders. So we need to dispel this enduring mendacious myth that Canada is a peacekeeping country. We are not. And the political parties, the NDP and the Green Party, need to challenge this because they actually continue this rhetoric. For instance, in their election platforms, they say that Canada is a peacekeeping country and we're proud about what our Canadian forces are doing. They are contributing to this myth making. And this is why we need to get Canada out of NATO, because it is not helping to bring about peace around the world. It's not stopping armed conflict. In fact, it's escalating it.
Thank you, Tamara. The next question is from Jonathan Dye, and it's a question for Paul. With the US-led NATO continuing to push aggressively, what are the chances that Russia, China, and Iran together to form a military alliance to fight back and therefore ignite a world war?
Clearly, the recent events, particularly since 2014, and the sort of ever-growing sanctions against Russia placed by the United States and other NATO allies, as well as the growing trade war between China and the United States, has driven China and Russia very much closer together. And to some degree, Iran as well, but I think Iran is relatively small fry compared with both China and the Russian Federation. And there's no doubt that Chinese-Russian relations are probably better now than they've ever been in history. There are growing economic connections. There are growing military connections as well. However, the odds of this actually going into a formal alliance, I think, are extremely remote. It's extremely unlikely to go that far for a number of reasons. The first is that I don't think either Russia or China wishes to be formally committed to defending the other. Why would Russia want to go to war because China was fighting Taiwan or something? This is, not in either side's interest. They also have some differences. I mean, China's been quiet about the annexation of Crimea, but it didn't like it very much, probably because it's not a great fan of separatism, and so it has never said anything negative about it, but it's never actually supported it. It's always abstained on this. So there's still some differences. Also, Russia also has very close relations with India, and given the conflicts between India and China, Russia would not want to be in too close an alliance with China, because that would then sunder its relationship with India. So the basic Russian approach is try and be on as good terms with as many people as possible, which means to try and to forge close relationships, but not to take them to the extent of formal alliances. And I think, therefore, that the idea of a sort of block of autocracies against a block of democracies or whatever is a little far-fetched. But of course, the more that pressure is piled up on Russia, the more it will, by necessity, turn towards China. And even quite moderate Russian foreign affairs experts are now basically saying that we should have as little to do with the West as possible, because there's no way we're going to get any agreement with them, and we should just go our own way.
Can I add to what Paul said, that we need to work with Russia and China to solve the climate crisis and to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And if we didn't treat China and Russia as enemies, we could have been working with these two countries, that have, developed the vaccine. We would be that much farther in ending this global pandemic if we were working cooperatively with them. So we need to stop looking at China and Russia as enemies. We have to stop this Cold War rhetoric, and we really need global cooperation and solidarity.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Tamara. So we're coming closer to the end of our time. We only have space for one or two more questions. The next one that we have is directed at all panelists. Could panelists discuss how NATO benefits US arms industry by boosting military spending and making alliance members' weapon systems interoperable with the US military?
Well, I think I already said that. I mean, it's I don't know the figures now, but it's a fact that if you look to the top 100 of military industry in the world, or the top 10 or the top 20, many of them are US corporations. So, and of course, there is a standardization of NATO weapons, and of course, this is benefiting the military industry in the United States. Not only in the United States, there are also important military corporations in Europe, but I think NATO is really to the benefit of it. And so if you have it's not only, when I said in Wales, there was this decision to have to try to aim to 2% of the BBP going to the military budget. There's another norm that has been a standard that has been decided, and it is that in these military budgets, 20% should go to military investments. For example, a country like Belgium in 2014 had only 5 or 6% of its military budget going into military investment, and now is forced to increase. Now it is about 11 or 12%, and it should go to 20%, for example, to purchase this F-35 fighter jets we just ordered last year or 2 years ago for 4 billion. So, of course, this is to the benefit of the military industry in the United States. Also, this increasement of defense budget and also of military investments.
And I would like to say that in 2017, the Liberal government announced its new defense policy called Strong, Secure, and Engaged. And it said very clearly that this defense policy is driven by our membership in NATO and our defense partnership with the United States. And in that defense policy, the Liberal government is going to spend $553 billion on the military to buy new attack helicopters, new tanks, to build warships, to buy fighter jets, to recruit more soldiers. So it's very much driven by NATO. Also, because of a defense agreement that Canada made with the United States about 70 years ago, Canada will not disclose all of the arms exports that we make to the United States. So that's a secret. But we know that, it's billions and billions of dollars that cross the border from Canada into the United States. Guns, tanks, components for US weapon systems. And of course, Canada supplies the United States with oil and with uranium and steel and other natural resources. The US war machine the US war machine needs. And then I'll also just mention that in 2018, the Liberal government announced a defense industrial policy that is going to, further subsidize the Canadian arms manufacturers in this country to continue to supply to the US war machine. So this is, we just really need to demilitarize our economic policy and stop the federal government from subsidizing US weapon systems.
Thank you. Our next question is, could panelists discuss NATO's increasing focus on China, towards China?
Very quickly, it's very, very dangerous. Canada has gotten itself into a mess following the US and arresting Meng Wanzhou at the behest of Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo, two people nobody should listen to. But NATO is, there has now been this, Obama called it the pivot to Asia, encircling China, which, as someone said earlier, is not a huge military power, sending ships to the South China Sea, which is by China. The attacks regarding allegations of human rights, and they are allegations. I wish we had more time to talk about the outright lies being told about China. So the US is leading the charge, but others are going along as usual, using these, and they use human rights because they know that gets public buy-in. You have to tell people that Gaddafi's killing people or there are slave laborers in China or something to get public support for very dubious policies. So NATO is completely on board, all the NATO nations, with joining in this effort to somehow control China, which is ridiculous. China is an economic power, will soon surpass the United States. It's very simple, and it is unfortunate that we have, it's frankly a fantasy that China can be contained and the US and its allies can run the entire world. It's a fantasy.
I just point out because China's nowhere near the North Atlantic, so that's the idea that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has anything to do with China is somewhat problematic in and of itself, and I think one should be very careful about everly expanding the parameters of what an organization does.
And let's also compare and contrast. NATO is militarizing the world. And what is China doing? China has its Belt and Road Initiative. It's investing in public transit, in light rail, in ports and infrastructure that the developing world needs. It is extremely dangerous that Canada is aligning with the United States to vilify China. We cannot have China as an enemy. We must be friends with China.
Thank you, Tamara. Ludo.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, to remind also that since, as you know, UK left the European Union with the Brexit, and they just published what they call a global review, and they just adopt the US policy on that. For example, talking about the Indo-Pacific tilt, doing a military buildup in around China again. So this is a very dangerous policy, as Tamara says. And then according to the Uyghur, because it's often mentioned as a pretext of confronting China, but if human rights would be important, then we wouldn't sell weapons to the Saudi Arabia. waging war and using them in Yemen. So I think it's just instrumentalizing human rights, which shouldn't be done. It would be I think there is a problem, of course, in China, as we have problems everywhere on human rights. And this should be dealt with in what they call common and cooperative security. It should be dealt with dialogue, with trying to convince to work differently on human rights. And this is maybe also interesting, because in the 70s we had this final act of Helsinki, creating a European security organization, which has been disappearing from the public or political agenda. But the idea was to dialogue and confidential building measures and talking with the others, because we only can be safe if the others feel safe. That's the idea of common and cooperative security, and that's what we need also towards China.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Unfortunately, we have so many more questions. I wish we had more time, but we have reached the end of our time together. It's been a totally extraordinary afternoon. Thank you so much. I know that I have personally learned a great deal. And so I just want to thank you, Margaret, thank you, Ludo, thank you, Tamara, thank you, Paul. Please, everybody, find out more about our panelists and the work that they are doing. It is very important work. Before we leave, I just want to give a few short announcements. As you know, this work is not possible without donations, so please consider making a contribution to the work of this Canadian Foreign Policy Institute at foreignpolicy.ca/donations. You can also become a monthly sustainer. Unlike the NATO Association of Canada or the Conference of Defense Associations or the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, we don't receive any funding from NATO or the military, the Canadian military, and we've been working relentlessly to build a more just foreign policy. To help build a more just foreign policy, and we really need your help. So please do donate, foreignpolicy.ca/donate. We also have a number of upcoming events that I want to draw your attention to. We have an event on Monday, April 5th at 7 p.m. featuring former MPs Libby Davies, Sven Robinson, as well as Hamam Farah, Sahia El Masri, and Rabbi David Miviser on Palestine solidarity and the importance of the upcoming NDP convention. Go to foreignpolicy.ca to find out more about that. We have a book launch coming up that we're sponsoring called Challenge the Strong Wind, Canada and East Timor, that is authored by fellow David Webster with a special guest, Elaine Briere. And we're also co-sponsoring an important event hosted by the Canadian Latin American Alliance with special UN Special Rapporteur, Elena Duan, and MP Don Davies on the human cost of sanctions in Venezuela. The link is in the chat. So thanks again to our incredible panelists. This has been awesome. Good afternoon to all of you. And that's it for our program today.
Peace. Peace out.
Peace. And if for anyone that hasn't noticed, Margaret's background, it's excellent. It's Canada.
It's true. Do I know my audience?
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.